Okay. So this is a public meeting. Remember to mute your microphones. This meeting is being recorded. Did you guys get the notice that the meeting is being recorded? Yes, okay, great. And then raise your hand feature, use the raise your hand feature when you have questions. Oh, got one more joining us. Okay, so we are going to do a quick attendance. Then this is the agenda for today. We're going to have program updates from Adam Coble. Then Mount Hood Environmental will be doing an update for us on their contract. And then Kate will be doing a presentation on, or just a update on the reforestation study. And I'm still admitting people here. Okay, so quick roll call. So let's see, Seth Barnes. Oh, so when I call your name, if you can just let me know if you're present. So Seth Barnes.
Present.
Thank you. Stephen Koski. Megan Tuttle.
Present.
Thank you. Amanda Astor.
Present, but for the record, just if you could change my last name, that'd be great.
Oh, yes, yes. Rick Zen. Steve Vaughn. I think he was going to be Josh Laughlin. Casey Kula.
Present.
Thank you. Emily Bowes.
Present.
Okay. Brandon Persinger. Okay. Rod Kramer. Josh Seeds. I just admitted him, so he should be here. And then Stephen Fitzgerald.
Here.
Did I miss anybody? Let me see. I believe, let's see. We've got a few guests on here. Just checking real quick. Okay. We have some ODF staff here as well. Terry Frew, Adam Coble, Kate Thompson, and myself. You guys know us. And I believe we have Arden Glenn is also on. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and hand this over to Adam.
Great, thanks, Rebecca. You want to advance the slide? Go ahead and advance again. So I'm going to provide just a few updates. One is around transparency for our program. I did receive some questions about that, and I've met with leadership within ODF to develop a plan towards making sure that we do have a transparent program. So I guess some of the steps towards that that goal of transparency. One is just having statistician from Mount Hood Environmental attend meetings on occasion to provide updates. So you're hearing it directly from Mount Hood Environmental and hearing about how they're approaching, the study planning development in terms of a statistically rigorous studies. The other is making data publicly available. We did receive a data request from committee member, provided that data from the reforestation study. And so that's, we provided anonymous data. And so to that end, something we've been discussing internally is developing a story map or a web page that has you know, a lot of the program information at everyone's fingertips. So anyone from the public can go to this website. You'll learn about the program, what our goals are, what the studies include. If as we start to collect data and analyze results and start with the reporting, that information is available as well. And I think so Washington DNR has a good model for this that I've looked into, and so I believe they're in transition right now between I think the manager of that program has left or is leaving, but I think once somebody's in place, we'll start some discussions there and pick their brain on their program and keep that line of communication open. Also, we will continue to provide the committee with protocols, deliverables from Mount Hood Environmental, our reports, and I guess one last thing, if there are any concerns about the program or staff, feel free to reach out to me, Nick, or Josh. So I put the information there, emails, for your reference. So before, I'm going to also discuss the reforestation study, the Mount Hood environmental kind of overview. Before I do that, are there any questions or comments on this transparency plan?
Well, Adam, this is Casey. This sounds great. Thank you. I appreciate seeing your response on this. And, we're all kind of learning here, I think, as we go, some of you with more knowledge than some of us. So thanks. And it's really good to know, like, okay, here's the process. Here's what will be available. Here are the people to go to. So thanks.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for that, Casey.
So Adam, when do you expect the story map / web page to be complete?
That'll be a little ways out. So, that process generally will look like getting a RFP, request for proposal, out, and then working through the procurement process, selecting the right contractor to set that up. But I can provide a more detailed timeline at the next meeting if you're okay with that.
Yeah, that would be great. I think it's a good idea. Sometimes things get pretty difficult to search for on the ODF website, so having a place for this would be useful. Thank you.
Yep.
And Adam, I've shared this with you before, but I sit on the Washington State Forest Practices Board. So we review the compliance monitoring reports at the board level. And with that staff transition going on, if anyone has any questions or needs access to DNR staff within their compliance monitoring or forest practices program, feel free to reach out to me and I can put you in the direction of who your best contact would be. And I'll let you know when that position is filled.
Okay, great. Yeah, I think that connection will help Megan. I'll reach out to you sometime over the next few weeks, and you can get me into contact with the right staff there. That would be great. Any other questions? Suggestions, anything that think should be added that we missed? Okay, Rebecca, do you want to go to the next slide? So today, Mark Rose from Mount Hood Environmental is going to present. Before he does that, I just wanted to provide a kind of an overview of their involvement with the compliance monitoring project and just kind of an overview of the contract. So with the reforestation study, that data collection, the team's going to start that in October, in about a month. So up to this point, Mount Hood Environmental has been working on designing and planning this reforestation study. So you may have seen some documents in an email, which I'll cover in a minute. So that was their primary involvement for phase 1, and then phase 2. After we collect the data next year, they'll be involved in the data analysis and some extent of the reporting. So that's phase 2 for reforestation. For the long-term compliance monitoring study, so this is compliance monitoring of the three priorities. That includes the water protection rules or riparian rules, roads, and harvesting on steep slopes. That study, Mount Hood Environmental will be involved in the designing and planning for phase 1. And like the reforestation study, there'll be the data collection period after phase 1, and then phase 2 will be data analysis and reporting. And so at some point, well, this initial phase 1 and 2 of the long-term study is trying to get us onto a cycle where every year there's a consistent process, so that it's and the same, the reporting to the board for the HCP, all of those reporting requirements, we want to try to get it into a consistent cycle. So that's the kind of the overview for Mount Hood Environmental. Rebecca, you can go to the next slide. And so Rebecca had sent out documents to everyone on the committee on September 5th. Here's the list. I believe the reforestation plan and protocol was, one of the higher, more important documents, not to minimize the other ones, but this includes the list of documents that were sent out. Rebecca, do you have anything to add on this slide regarding the documents?
Just that Mount Hood Environmental did a really good job kind of laying out the whole process, from like looking at the pilot study, providing feedback, and then using that information to inform the reforestation plan and protocol. So they did a really good job of kind of explaining it in those memos. So to get the kind of how we got here, you can read the the A, B, C, and E attachments, and then D is kind of the outcome that we are moving forward with, the reforestation plan and protocol.
Thanks, Rebecca. So before I hand it over to Mark, are there any questions on those 2 slides? All right, I'm not hearing any, so I'll hand it over to Mark Rose, statistician with Mount Hood Environmental. Mark, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Adam. I'll steal the screen. Oh, it's disabled for me. Rebecca, do you think you'd be able to allow me to share my presentation?
Yes, I might need help figuring this out. Let's see. If I go to you and then make co-host. Okay. It should work now.
There we go. All good? Everyone can see?
why you came over here. Oh, that's why you came
Yes.
over. Come
All
here, baby.
right. It's like somebody's puppy came to them. My dog always likes to come to me whenever I'm presenting things. It's great. So thanks, Adam. I'm Mark Rose. I'll introduce the team also present at this meeting. So we also have Mark Tepley, who's a senior scientist at Mark Tepley Consulting, and Kevin Cedar, who's a quantitative silviculturist at Woodland Creek Consulting. Before getting into it, I'll tell you what I'm going to tell you. So first, I'll cover some background context leading up to the reforestation study, then a summary of our review of the pilot study and the materials provided by the team at ODF, and then following that with our recommendations and the final study design and field protocols, and then next steps, which I think Adam did a decent job of already covering. Thanks, Adam. So first, a brief background on previous compliance monitoring efforts and the current reforestation study. So the implementation study that occurred in between 2013 and 2017, Mountain Environmental reviewed that back in 2021 and provided a suite of recommendations for a future implementation study. The implementation study focused on things like rules surrounding roads and steep slopes. But now we're in the world of the reforestation study, which started with that pilot study in 2021. And I want to point out that there's a few key differences between the implementation study and the current reforestation study. So, the FPA rules being examined are different, which means your study population and your study design is also going to be a little different. But there are some similarities, like the sample draw process and dealing with things like landowner non-response and harvest unit access. So while our recommendations from the review of the prior implementation study aren't all appropriate to apply to the reforestation study, some of them are, and we can apply some of those recommendations that we developed in the past. So a little bit of context on the reforestation study. This is looking at some FPA rules that have to do with reforestation. So the 3 FPA rules that are being examined are planting timeliness, so that planting is completed within 24 months following a commercial forest operation. Acceptable species, so that harvest units are restocked with acceptable species. And finally, free to grow stocking density, so that stands of free to grow trees that meet minimum stocking requirements laid out in statute is established by 6 years after harvest operation. So in 2021, the reforestation study kicked off with a pilot. The purpose of the pilot study, as well as our review of the pilot study, was to inform the study design and field methods for the current reforestation study proper. Little bit of background information there. So the field sampling methods used, or let's see, sorry. It evaluated compliance 2 years post-operation and looked at harvest units with private industrial land ownership only and examined those 3 FPA rules that I just mentioned. So since we were looking at compliance 2 years post-operation, evidence of planting was directly observed. And then species that were planted were recorded to evaluate reforestation with acceptable species. But since we were looking 2 years post-operation, planting density was used as a surrogate for free-to-grow stocking density. So that free-to-grow stocking density rule kicks in 6 years after harvest operation, but planting timeliness is 2 years after operation. So our primary conclusion there was that if stocking density of free-to-grow trees is not being directly observed and planting density is used as a surrogate for it, this makes the assumption that planting density is a reliable indicator for free-to-grow stocking. From prior studies, we know this isn't necessarily the case. You can have, seedling mortality to occur for a multitude of reasons, leading to that seedling density not being reflective of future free-to-grow stocking density. And we'll come back to that. So a little bit of information on the survey design of the pilot study. So how surveys were conducted was a series of survey points distributed across harvest units. And these points were associated with potential plot locations and included a number of alternate survey points. So you see on the right there, just a simple diagram of our survey point with a surrounding fixed width plot and some trees in there that can be counted. So this method provided a high degree of harvest unit coverage because the points were distributed throughout the harvest unit. So you get a good glimpse of what is the conditions across the entire unit. However, these points frequently would end up being located in locations that were not suitable for planting. So things like the point was on a road or it was on bare rock or things like that. Something you can't control when you're looking necessarily on GIS and setting up that survey design. For a number of reasons, there were a variable number of samples, so survey plots within each harvest unit, which led to a different amounts of degree of certainty regarding whether a unit was in compliance or not in compliance with stocking density in particular. Results from this study informed recommendations. So one thing that was identified was mitigating the effect of those unsuitable survey locations on the sample size. And one result was that mean compliance with planting timeliness was 97%. So for the private industrial landowner class, which is what was looked at here, 36 out of the 37 harvest units were in compliance with planting within 24 months. And finally, planting with unacceptable species was not observed in the sample. Following our review of the pilot study, our team reviewed the draft study design and field protocol developed for the reforestation study proper. So first, we coordinated with the team at ODF to define the focus of the study. This includes defining our study questions, the population, and sampling elements. These lay the groundwork and dictate how results are reported. So first, identifying the study question, which is what's the estimated percent compliance with those 3 reforestation FPA rules? And next is getting to the population. So who does that apply for? What was identified was this will apply for clear-cut operations between 2 and 120 acres in size with lands owned by private industrial and private non-industrial landowners. And additionally, we were going to stratify by landowner type. So what this means is that we can answer the question, the study question, for the population and report compliance for private industrial landowners, report compliance for private non-industrial landowners, as well as them together. So how would that data be collected? First, you need a sample of harvest units. So harvest units would be surveyed to obtain a single determination of compliance or non-compliance by FBA rule. And those harvest units are drawn from the Ferns notification database. And then within each harvest unit, a sampling design is applied to obtain a reliable determination of compliance. A couple additional considerations to note here in the general study design. One is that the study will not evaluate compliance within riparian management areas. So that will be excluded within harvest units. And then additionally, to reduce assumptions that planting timeliness and free to grow stocking are examined separately. So what does that mean? That means separate samples of harvest units for compliance with free to grow stocking and planting timeliness. This way you don't need to make the assumption that seedling density is reflective of free to grow stocking density 4 years later. So the sample set for free to grow stocking is harvest units that were complete, where operations were completed 6 years prior. Additionally, stocking with acceptable species will be evaluated within that sample. And then separately, planting timeliness would be evaluated from a sample 2 years after harvest completion. So this results in 2 independent samples of harvest units, and in fact, 2 independent study designs within the reforestation study umbrella. And these study designs share many similarities, like the sample draw process and things like that. But since they're independent, results from one won't impact the other. So if you had a different sample size as one than the other, there's no cross-pollination there. Results from one won't affect the other. Or if you conducted one this year and the other sample set in the future, they're independent, so there wouldn't be any issue there. Moving ahead to our recommendations for getting those samples of harvest units. So like I said, harvest units will be drawn from the ferns database, which I believe John is already working really hard on doing. And we need to have some additional considerations here because ferns notifications only state an intent to harvest, not that harvest was completed. And participation in this study is voluntary. So you may reach out to a landowner and they might not respond, or they might refuse access for the study. So you have to deal with and mitigate for that. And that'll be done via a sample overdraw process. So the idea is, let's say you wanted to get 30 samples. If you drew 30 samples of harvest units, but some of those landowner didn't respond or the harvest wasn't completed, you don't end up with 30. So you need to draw some more. And that's called sample overdraw. And the amount of sample overdraw was informed by the prior implementation study. So the non-response completion rates from the prior implementation study. And how this draw process works, it's a random overdraw from ferns, and with the addition of some pre-screening to better determine harvest completion. So using things like aerial and Landsat imagery or other indicators like herbicide application permits to have a better grasp on, was the harvest completed for this notification?
Mark,
So that gives me, yes.
Megan has a question.
Go ahead, Megan.
I just sort of wanted to level set for everybody that with the 2024 rule changes, those problems for overdraws will go away because starting in January, we will actually have to report when activities are complete and landowners are required to participate. So sorry, Mark, I didn't want to interrupt your flow, but I think that's sort of key for everybody on the committee to understand that this is a short-term problem we're dealing with now and won't be a long-term issue for future compliance monitoring projects.
Thank you, Megan.
Yeah, thanks, Megan. It'll definitely alleviate, I'm sure, a number of headaches on some folks. So once we have that sample of harvest units, where do we go next? Well, next you would collect the data. But before getting into the data, I'm a statistician and I need to talk about the analysis because that drives the study design as well as things like your sample size. So, and before getting into anything in the weeds here, I just want to preface that the intent of this slide here is to provide some context rather than get into the technical nitty-gritty points of this. So the main thing I wanted to cover here is confidence intervals versus tolerance intervals. So when we report compliance, it'll be reported as your mean compliance. So 36 out of 37 were in compliance, 97% compliance, simple as that. But you're working with a sample, not a census of the entire population. So you need some sort of measure of uncertainty surrounding that 97%. And traditionally, that's done in most studies using a confidence interval, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, like a 95% confidence interval between this value and another value. But when working with this compliance data that ranges from 0% to 100% and is often somewhere near 100% from the information of the prior studies, those confidence intervals start to make a little bit less sense, and we didn't think they were entirely applicable. So instead, we recommended tolerance intervals, in particular, one-sided tolerance intervals. So these are frequently used in production environments. Like let's say somebody's building a car and they're making a car part, and they're going to produce 1,000 of those, and they want to know, of those 1,000, how many can we expect are within spec and we can actually use them? And you'd use a tolerance interval for that. So you'd use that and you'd say, okay, we estimate that at least 90% confidence, we estimate that at least 90% of these, 900 out of 1,000 will meet our specs. And tolerance intervals are a tool to do that. And we thought those were particularly suited for this type of study. You can look at that nice boring bell curve on the right that represents 100% of the population lies under that curve. The idea with a tolerance interval is we want to estimate, for example, where's the point where at least 90% of the population is above that curve. So what a tolerance interval does is it estimates where that dashed line is. And it describes the portion of the population at or above a value. So you can make statements like, we estimate with 90% confidence that compliance for at least 90% of harvest units is some amount. It's at least 95% for at least 90% of the harvest units. So it gives you a little bit more utility there than simply stating, okay, it's somewhere within a range when we're looking at the uncertainty. And I wanted to cover all this because that drives the sample size of harvest units, which is all covered within those documents that Adam and Rebecca mentioned earlier. So the sample size of harvest units was calculated to obtain reliable one-sided tolerance intervals for 80 or 90% of the population with 90% certainty. Now getting back into the fun stuff, how do we collect the data? First, looking at the free-to-grow stocking surveys. Similar to the pilot study, survey points are equally distributed in a grid throughout the unit, and those survey points are the center of fixed width plots. This type of method gives you a consistent coverage of the harvest unit. As you see, those points are spread equally throughout the unit. Now, going over this little map here, we have all these little points, and how a survey would happen is a surveyor would go out to a harvest unit and they would navigate to one of these points. If the point was suitable for a survey, so if it was a spot that could be planted and it wasn't on a road or anything like that, then they would simply conduct a survey on a fixed width 1/50th of an acre circular plot, tallying the trees, recording the size and the species of those trees as well. However, it's quite likely that there's going to be some points that might not be suitable for various reasons, and we identified the most common reasons that those points were unsuitable based on results of the pilot study, and developed a simple offset procedure to mitigate for that. What that means is, let's say on the far top of the map there, you have that point with the red arrow associated with it. So that point was originally located on a road. But since you can't take a survey on a road, you use a simple offset procedure, move that point away from the road, and then you can conduct a survey there. What that means is that you will always meet a minimum sample size within all these harvest units. So the estimate of compliance or non-compliance is going to have a consistent amount of confidence across harvest units. Now going ahead to the sample size of survey plots. So we have a sample of harvest unit, a sample size for our harvest units, and then inside every harvest unit, you also need a sample size of survey plots. And we calculated a sample size of survey plots so that you can use those one-sided tolerance intervals again to estimate the minimum stocking for at least 80% of the unit with 90% confidence. So what you can do is you collect that data for the harvest unit, and then you calculate the tolerance interval, and you can say, okay, we estimate that at least 80% of this unit, minimum 80% of this unit is stocked to 200 trees per acre with 90% confidence. And then you can use that to determine compliance or non-compliance for the harvest unit. And using these, I ran these methods through the pilot study data, and it results in similar but more rigorous determinations of compliance. I also just want to mention that additionally, compliance with acceptable species will be determined within this sample set, but that's a much simpler method, because you're either you planted species that are acceptable and on the list of acceptable species, or you didn't. Moving on to the planting timeliness surveys. Reminder again that this is independent from free to grow study design that we just covered. I won't be spending too much time on these planting timeliness recommendations, as the team at ODF has indicated that planting timeliness surveys may not be occurring this year. So planting is a binary response. Either you planted or you didn't plant. And we provided two design approaches to offer some flexibility for examining planting timeliness. The first we call systematic surveys, which are a survey point and plot design, very much similar to those free to grow surveys we just went over. So folks go out to a survey point and they look in the vicinity of the survey point. Did planting happen here or did it not? And then they go to another survey point throughout a harvest unit. The other option is simplified surveys, what we call them. So those are simply visual surveys of all portions of the harvest unit that are suitable for planting. So a surveyor doesn't have to navigate to specific points, but can rather walk throughout a unit with sufficient coverage to ensure that a reliable determination of yes, planting was completed or no, planting was not complete. So for both of these studies, quality control has been identified by the team at ODF as an important component of the study design for transparency and reliability and other agency goals. So quality control takes the form of replicate quality control surveys. And the intent here is to mitigate for potential bias and observer error. So observer error, measurement error, that happens in every study everywhere. You're measuring something, you're going to be off by some amount, but we deal with that by assuming that error averages out to 0. The concern is only if there's some bias there. And we can account for that through those replicate surveys, which would be conducted on a 10% random subset of the harvest units using the same field methods, but a different observer. And then results from the quality control survey would be compared to the original survey. If they're consistent, if Survey 1 results in saying, hey, this unit's in compliance. Survey 2 says, hey, this unit's in compliance. You're all good. If there's an inconsistency there, a second quality control survey would be triggered, and that would occur at another harvest unit where the original surveyor had collected data. If there's also an issue at the second unit, that would trigger some remediation actions because it revealed there might be some systemic error happening here. And options for remediation include, additional training or supervised surveys at model sites. Now to start wrapping up here, there were a couple additional considerations I wanted to mention that we recommended. One is looking at that definition of free to grow that's used in the study, because free to grow can be tricky to nail down with an objective definition. And that's something that's not only a challenge for this study, but it's a challenge within many forestry agencies. And getting to an acceptable definition of free to grow that, one person can determine if something's free to grow and somebody else gets the same determination can be a challenge. So ODF is handling that, and they've been doing work on hammering down that definition. And then finally, we had a couple of recommendations on technology to help with efficiency. One is using spatial data collection software like field maps or Survey 123 that bundles together your spatial information automatically with your survey information. And the spatial component is important to this study, so we thought that was pretty applicable. And that can also be bundled with some high accuracy GNSS systems like the Trimble Catalyst. Another recommendation for efficiency using technology would be to use drones for this rather than surveyors walking through harvest units. So using drones to identify if planting occurred or collecting density data. Now, this seems really promising, but it would definitely require some additional research, field testing, ground truthing, stuff like that to make sure that the results from drone surveys would be consistent with the results from boots on the ground surveys. Moving on to our next steps, which Adam definitely already touched on. So we'll be, our team at MHE will be continuing our coordination with ODF to ensure that the study design field protocols can result in a successful study with reliable, statistically rigorous results. If there are any speed bumps hit on the way, so you know how field studies go, things can happen, and if alterations to the field protocols are necessary, any proposed changes will be reviewed by our team to ensure that statistical rigor is maintained. Later this fall, we'll be coordinating with ODF to look at that non-response issue, which this is the last hurrah of non-response, and taking a look at how that might impact our sample before the data is collected. And then finally, next spring, we'll be conducting the analysis on the data collected during the reforestation study and delivering a manuscript detailing our methods and all the materials we used to produce the analysis. So thanks for the time, folks. Appreciate it. Here's a nice picture of Mount Hood with some fire. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. I am going to share my screen again.
Before we move on, does anybody have any questions for Mark?
Yeah, this is Casey. I did have one. Mark, thank you. That presentation, I thought, complemented really well the ABCDE documents rather than just being like a rehashing of them. So thank you for that. Thanks for saving us time. The one of your slides talked about, oh my gosh, I'm gonna forget this now. it raised an issue that I guess I think ODF staff have talked about, specifically John Hawksworthy and his field work, which is how many is the minimum number of like plots to take to get a solid tolerance and I guess solid confidence without being too many, right? And I don't know if you all I missed that and you addressed it with ODF staff, but it seems like an important thing to like, unless there's technology involved in data collection, it's time consuming and making sure that it's not more than our necessary sample plots. So over to you, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thanks, Casey. That was definitely a consideration. I mean, ideally, you want to be able to conduct these surveys in one day, even if it's a 120 acre harvest. So where we ended up, I believe, was about 27 points within each harvest unit, regardless of the size of the harvest unit. And that makes the assumption that I think up to 35% of those points might be unsuitable based on the pilot study results. And then, some of those can be mitigated from the offset procedure. The idea is, hey, you go to a point, if it's not suitable and it's not easy to offset, like clearly the area around it is not going to be suitable, you just go to the next one. You don't need to fuss around trying to figure out where you could take one of those points, because we built in a small buffer to ensure that you're going to meet that minimum sample size.
Cool, and thank you. That was helpful. And then on the stratified versus the simplified survey, presumably there's some different conclusion that you like the language of your conclusion, or is there a different conclusion that you can draw from that one that's the planting timeliness?
So the systematic versus simplified surveys, yes. So I would say the conclusions would be similar. I mean, the way you get to saying compliance occurred or planting occurred or did not occur is slightly different. But when you summarize that, each harvest unit essentially becomes one data point. So it's either in compliance or it's not in compliance. So
Okay,
once you start zooming out,
yeah.
it's all the same.
Yeah, because it's still one data point. Okay, that was what I was wondering. Thank you.
Any other questions?
So I just wanted to quickly add one thing, and saying this because I don't want to catch anyone off guard once the report comes out and the analysis is happening. But so Mark and his team provided a recommendation for free to grow study and a timing of planting study. And based on that 90% confidence, and Mark, you can correct me if I'm wrong, I believe it was around 73 sites for each study. And so, that brings up the question of based on our resources, what we have time to accomplish, and, is it feasible to collect data at 146 sites to complete both studies? So right now we are focusing on the free to grow study. And the plan is to reevaluate as we get into that study a few weeks in, to look, refine our projection a little bit in terms of the length of study of the time to determine whether we have time and resources to do the timing of planting study. And there's some other factors there. Staff might be working on the web page or the web map or the story map. And then, but we also want to make sure that, for that bigger compliance, that long-term study, that we have, time to plan for that as well, because we don't want to be, rushing and pulling that together last minute. So I just wanted to mention that right now it is the focus is on the free to grow study. And there's a chance that we may not collect any data on the timing of planting study. So I don't know if there's any questions on that or concerns, but I wanted to be clear about that and not surprise anyone.
Yeah, Adam, thanks for that heads up. This is Casey again. The one question along the lines though of that is Mark mentioned smalls and bigs, I think, or just hoping to be able to separate out the two different scales of timber landowners. Is your study designed for the free to grow planning to be able to identify those two groups and make conclusions from each?
Yes. Yep. That's separated out. All right, well, I think we can move on to the next topic unless there's anyone have more questions for Mark. All right, Kate, you're up next.
Excellent. Just quick following on the heels of this last conversation. Just wanted to make sure that everybody knew that if you think of a question after the fact, feel free to email us at the compliance monitoring at odf.oregon.gov email address, and we'll consolidate those and get those to MHE. And then we'll send any responses back to the committee via email once we've gotten that all compiled. So a quick update on where we are in the office for the reforestation study. This is like 3 whole slides here. So it's a pretty quick update, but I want to talk about the field trip that we did not too long ago. The activities that we have completed in preparation for next steps, which will be going out in the field and collecting data. There's a lot of legwork that goes on in the background before any of this happens, and then what our next steps are going to be. So if you could move on to the next slide, please. First off, I want to thank Stephen Fitzgerald for hosting us. Thank you. That was very kind of you to offer your space for us to take a look. So I'm on injured reserve and unfortunately did not get to go out on this trip, but had some really good photos come back talking about kind of free to grow, looking at trees, looking at stocking density, talking about some of the challenges that happened on the sites that the team visited. So you can see in this poor little guy on the left here that there's some pretty heavy browse on that seedling. It's been just eaten. And if you look at the middle, you can see this was actually a pretty complex site that, if you look at the picture, the trees look pretty good. They're all above all the false brome. They're seem to be doing okay. But if you look outside of the frame, there was a lot more competition going on. And that's a challenge with free to grow because the criteria that we're working with right now are that free to grow status are defined as vigorous, healthy, and dominant over undesired competing vegetation. You can see in this shot that there's some invasive species issues going on there, and so that's something that we'll be mindful of going forward. And then this last photo, the one on the right, is a lot about site suitability. You can correct me if I'm wrong about this, Stephen, because of course, I wasn't there, so I'm getting the secondhand. But my understanding is that site used to be oak savanna and might not be suitable for Douglas fir. So there's some questions about what might be most appropriate to plant there. Is that correct?
That's correct. I mean,
Okay.
as we've looked and saw mortality happening, they're on sites that are formerly more oak dominated, and Doug fir is seeded in the absence of fire. So we might need to take a look at what the suitability issue across, particularly in the foothills of the Willamette Valley, where you have Doug fir, but there's a lot of these past oak habitats.
Thanks for that. And next slide, please. So along with the field trip, we've completed a lot of other things. John has been doing heroic work in the background. So he's extracted all of the ferns data. So that's every clear cut that ferns identified as having a scheduled completion date in 2016 to 2017. Each one of those was pulled and assigned a random number. We flagged the duplicates so that people didn't get pulled twice. John went in and used Landsat and aerial imagery to further screen. So he took that and laid on a GIS layer that showed where fires had been. And if most or all of the unit was in a perimeter of a fire that had happened since 2017, those were excluded. Per MHE's recommendations, drew an oversample. So it's back to that, 90% confidence that 80% of the site meets standards. Ended up with a sample of 38 private industrial, 38 private non-industrial, with an oversample of 14 for private industrial and 133 additional private non-industrial. Reached out to stewardship foresters who have been helping us out with this. So part of this is just because they need to know what's going on in their territory. We're not just marching in there and doing things without their knowledge. But we reached out to them in early and mid-August to see if we could get some additional site information from them. Did they know if the operations were completed? Are the landowners the same? So did the land get sold? Has there been, some change in property ownership? If they knew if there'd been a fire impact on the unit. And then we coordinated with them to make sure they know, well, what we're up to. We're going to be taking a look at harvest units to see if what they planted is free to grow. Make sure that we're respecting any hard-earned relationships between stewardship foresters and landowners. So if they wanted to reach out to someone on our behalf, they were welcome to do that. We did have one stewardship forester do that. Greatly appreciated. The goal of the stewardship forester outreach, other than the simple task of keeping them in the loop, is to help increase participation by getting the stewardship foresters involved. And to increase that communication with the field staff. Just Monday, we sent out letters requesting access to all selected landowners. We've already gotten a few responses back, so that's exciting. We're waiting to hear more. And next slide, please. So right at the moment, we're doing a lot of making things. So putting together survey material. So this would be like a packet for each site for which we receive permission. So, with maps and instructions and data collection information and any supporting materials. So reference pictures, anything that will help people make decisions consistently as far as what is or is not free to grow. But this is something that's happening over time because we need approvals from landowners to include the maps. So that part will likely happen later, but all that's being assembled. But we have 3 days, I believe, set up to coordinate in the field, make sure that everybody's on the same page about what and how is being, what's being collected and how it's being collected, so that everybody's doing it the same way. This is really important to make sure that our data are consistent across survey teams. As permissions come in, we'll be starting field surveys. Our target date is October. Since we do have a few yeses already, we'll definitely be heading out to those folks. But a lot of it's going to kind of depend on how and when things come in and where those sites are located. We'll be doing QA/QC on 10% of the sites, just to make sure that everybody's being consistent. There aren't any inconsistencies we need to address among survey teams. And then we're going to be working on a plan to store our data in a way that it is accessible and locatable, and all of the important things that come with making sure that everything is housed in a good, safe place. Once we've completed the survey, we do have the option for landowners, if they would like it, we will send them a report of what they found, just on their unit. So that's something that is kind of a hypothetical right now because we don't know who says yes, but we do have a plan to do that if folks want that information. Next slide, please. And that's all I have. So if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer. I'm hearing somebody in the background, but I'm not sure if somebody's mic's unmuted or if they're trying to answer a question or ask a question.
That was me. That was the background here at the office.
Oh, okay. Because I didn't want to miss somebody. Okay, well, if there are no questions right now, do feel free to email us at the compliancemonitoring@odf.oregon.gov email address, and we will be happy to answer those questions as they occur to you. And I'm gonna hand it back off to Rebecca to close out today.
Thank you, Kate. I sent out the draft compliance monitoring program committee charter. Did everyone receive it? If you have not, let me know. I wanted to see if everybody's good with that approach, to send in your edited drafts to the compliance monitoring email. I did get one request that they were going to send it to me, just notes, and that's acceptable. So yeah, if you have another method of which you want to share your input, please reach out to me. I also wanted to talk to everyone about meeting schedule preferences moving forward. If we want to set up a day and time each quarter, or if you would prefer quarterly doodle polls, given people's schedules are can be kind of sporadic. So I wanted to get your thoughts on approach to scheduling our meetings. Does anybody have any thoughts?
I like a set time. This is Casey. Then I set it on my schedule because I can see it far enough and out.
Yeah, same here.
Okay. Anyone else?
I agree.
Okay. So we will set a day and time for beginning in sometime, like we'll do it now. We'll get a date and time for the first quarter of 2024. And that's it. Any questions about what we've presented today? If not, it looks like you may, do I see any questions? I'm not seeing any.
Just one last thing that
Okay.
I don't know that it was mentioned, but if you have questions for Mark or Mount Hood Environmental, you can direct them to us, and then we can get that to Mark and kind of be the go between you and Mark. So we've questions, email the compliance monitoring email, and we'll get back to you.
Thank
Looks
you,
like-
Rebecca, for keeping us on track and organized for this meeting. I really appreciate your style. And I will say, since we're such a quiet group, that I also really appreciate Kate's comment that the landowners will be able to access their site information. That's a big improvement over what's happened in the past. So we do appreciate that information is wrapped up and randomized when it's publicly shared, but the fact that we can now get our individual results, I think, can be really helpful for things like our SFI certification, and also looking for ways to continuously improve if we find things.
Great, and it looks like you guys are going to get an hour back.
That'll give me an hour to look at the charter more closely. More closely, not look at more closely, look at it.
Well, yes, your input is greatly appreciated and your time is greatly appreciated. So,
Agreed.
well, I guess the next thing you'll be seeing an email related to a date and time for the first quarter of 2024, and we can get something that works for everybody, or at least try.
That sounds great. Thanks, Rebecca.
Well, I guess one last question I have before you sign off. This reforestation piece, Adam, thinking about, I think this is a question for you, thinking about the future and with the new rules going into place, but not until this year. Like, what's your thoughts in terms of moving forward? Obviously, this next year will be reforestation. How many years need to go by in your mind before we have a different conversation about, some of the new rules being monitored?
Yeah, well, that's going to be, so Rebecca and other staff in our unit are starting to look at the new rules, focusing initially on the riparian rules, and evaluating, Rebecca, correct me if I'm wrong, but evaluating, can we develop a study around these rules, and which rules should we be monitoring specifically for compliance monitoring? Because some are kind of lend themselves to more qualitative versus quantitative, right? It's hard to say yes, there's compliance, or no, there's not compliance there. So we are starting to look at that, and I don't know if it'll be the next meeting that we'll start that discussion. That may be too soon, but I would anticipate next year, early next year at the latest, where we'll start to have those conversations, and you can get a glimpse into that process. So, looking ahead even further, so the new rules go into effect January of 2024, the bulk of them. And so we'll get that first grab after the end of 2024. Landowners will need to, notify of completion. So January of 25 then is when we can get our first selection of study sites. And then once we have that, our sites selected, then we can start data collection in 2025. I'm not exactly sure what month there, but we're looking at the timeline, developing a more refined timeline there, which we'll share. And so initially it's going to be riparian rules, and then the plan is to get on the cycle of riparian rules 1 year, and then road rules and harvesting on steep slopes the next year, and then back to riparian the next. So it's going to be back and forth, which will allow that kind of that longer term trend monitoring. So that's my vision for the next 2 years for the longer term compliance study. But we'll start to pull together some documents that help summarize that, so you can kind of see that and visualize that.
That'd be great. Thanks.
Yep. Amanda, you've got your hand up.
Yeah. So to kind of, since we've got time to go along with Seth's question, it's good to hear kind of what your thoughts are as far as what topics you guys are looking at covering, and what that structure might look like moving forward with the new rules. As it relates to what questions are going to be asked as it relates to compliance, what parts of those rules are going to be monitored first, and how engaged do you think this committee is going to be in developing that? Because, obviously you and many others on this call have been deeply entrenched in some of the conversations on the AMPC as it relates to developing those types of study questions. So I'm just curious, how much do you think that's going to be driven by staff versus this group?
Well, like a lot of things, I think when we start looking at those rules to monitor for, we certainly will be sharing that, a proposed plan to this committee. And we will welcome all feedback on those initial, proposed rules that we'll monitor. And so, yeah, I mean, we'll be open to any feedback on that. I don't, Rebecca, you're a little bit working a little bit closer on that aspect of it. I don't know if you have anything to add there.
Yeah, definitely bringing the, like, we'll have the, outline the process that we went through. And then working with MHE with creating this study design, making sure that the questions that, or the rules that we're selected, fit. And then, yes, definitely we'll want feedback from the committee on, are we making a good, are these a good set? Is it practical? Is it, because going through each of the rules, there are many that, like, it really takes a stewardship forester at the time to assess versus trying to assess it a year and a half later, where you won't be able to, tell. So yes, we'll be having those conversations and welcome the feedback from this committee.
Yeah, and something that I'm starting to think about is how do we do that, share that information in a way that we get effective feedback. In other words, how do we, like, what's sort of the format and make it as easy as possible for the committee to look through those rules and evaluate what our proposal is. So yeah.
Steven?
The academic in me, I think that potentially this could make a good journal article as far as looking at ways to assess compliance, the statistical procedure. And so others might be able to learn from it. Certainly students can. I mean, students take a lot of statistics, but here this is a very applied one. And here's, the questions, the sample size, the confidence interval, all those feed right into statistics and what foresters that are out in the field have to pay attention to. So I know this would be down the road, but I think that it could make a really good journal article, like in the Journal of Forestry or something like that.
Yeah, I think that's appreciate that comment. I was an academic myself, and I thought I was done with publishing, but maybe that time isn't over yet. Any other comments? Oh, go ahead, Rebecca.
I was just going to note, the process we started with for each of those three rule divisions is to look at each individual rule. So, and then assessing it, like, is this something, is it measurable? So I welcome, you guys on your Friday nights, if you want to go through rules. If there's one that gets your attention and you want to, talk about it, feel free to email that compliance monitoring, like if there's a particular rule that you're thinking about, because we'll definitely put that input, but we'll be bringing that to the group.
Yeah, and along those lines, Rebecca, you've reached out to field support as well, I believe. There's sort of a mini work group that's looking at that too.
Yes, and even some stewardship foresters, our wildlife biologists, a training committee. So yeah, we've had a lot of eyes on it, but I really welcome the in the field eyes, the stewardship foresters, and then folks here on this committee.
Amanda?
Yeah, I was just going to say, if you're already going through that process, Rebecca, having that information and just sort of like a living document sooner rather than later would be really great for us to start chewing through rather than getting something, just a few weeks before our next quarterly meeting, because there is a lot of exactly what you're talking about, where it's like, okay, can we actually measure this? Like I'm thinking about from the Associated Loggers perspective, like ELZs, right? How do we ensure compliance with ELZs? Well, it's really tough when you don't necessarily know what the soil and the ground looked like prior to entering into those places. And so, like you said, a stewardship forester is going to have a better understanding of whether or not that soil disturbance threshold was met, if that's the thing that we're looking at, measuring for compliance, and whether or not mitigations were taken in compliance with the FPA. So, I'm thinking about that one because it affects our, my members most kind of distinctly. But yeah, it's like, okay, well, how do we measure compliance? It has to be very place-based, time-based. And I don't know, like, I just don't really know. So it'd be interesting to see kind of what your guys' thoughts are, and see if there's any other additional thoughts that we can weigh in on, and respond to questions or comments that you guys might have from our specific perspective. So anyways, I don't know how you want to go about that, but I'm just thinking as far as being able to have access to some of that stuff earlier rather than later would be really beneficial.
Oh, that sounds good. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll appreciate that, Amanda. We'll discuss within our unit and start to look at sort of the agenda for the next meeting, and try to get that out to the committee as soon as possible. Once we had a chance for ODF staff like stewardship foresters and field support unit to take a look at that and kind of get our ducks in a row. So appreciate that.
Does anyone have anything else they'd like to add, or? Well, then I also look forward to comments on the charter. I know I gave you a deadline. I can't remember the deadline. I think it was end of October, or sometime mid-October. But yes, definitely bring those in so we can get that completed and signed off on. I hope you guys have a great day. And thank you again.
Yeah, thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.